Hello, my name is Dr. Craig Johnston. I'm a university lecturer who is today going to talk about a recent article I wrote called Alternative Spaces of Failure. I want to apologise, I did mean to do this video quite some time ago, but like most of us, we've been extremely busy doing whatever we do. Hopefully the video as itself won't be too long and will give you some insight into the article itself. And perhaps a little insight into future research that I hope to do. First and foremost, who am I? Just my background. I don't normally talk about background, but I think in this case it's important for teachers, for educators to know that actually in a lot of cases researchers have a background working in this particular area. And for me, I've spent 25 years working predominantly with young people on the margins of society, that is in acute psychiatric wards. As a mental health counsellor, I've worked in social services, as a youth worker, I've worked in and out of schools, for FE colleges, etc., etc. And that's partly how the Alternative Spaces of Failure came about. And I was able to do an ethnographic study with a group of young people on the margins of education. And I was particularly interested in a group of the disabled bad boys, as they self-proclaimed themselves. So the article itself draws on as an ethnographic study. Took about a year to do, of a group of school-aged, disabled, white, working class, self-claimed bad boys. Now, in terms of disability, I think it's somewhere in the region of 54% of young people who are permanently excluded from school have a disability in England, and a much larger percentage in terms of those who are excluded from free school meals as well. So working class young people, or working class neighbourhoods that they come from. I don't like the word deprived, disadvantaged backgrounds as well, and I think some of the region of 70% are males, so you're more likely to be excluded if you fall into those categories, which made the study focus on that particular group. But there was another reason for that as well, and that was partly when I was doing the study. There was about 30 young people involved in the study, and hopefully I can use some of their voices in future studies, future research articles. But I was particularly interested in this group of young people because they were just like my mates in school, and I found that very intriguing, that in the 30 years since I left school, that actually they're talking about the same things, they're doing the same things, their ideas of the world in a sense haven't changed. They've changed in terms of technology and the way they interact with the world, and perhaps some of those ideas were reflecting these imaginary ideas of what they were going to do in terms of making money off of YouTube, but they were no more fanciful and far more grounded in the realities of the manual labour, the sense of masculinity that was very much part of my community when I grew up was exactly the same as theirs. And being positioned in this way, it made it very difficult for them to access, in a sense, a lot of those professions that don't exist anymore in terms of manufacturing society. So in terms of Willis's study in 1977, a lot of the ideas of masculinity, a lot of ideas about the body, about the masculine body, about how you use bodily functions, etc., were exactly the same, and I found that very intriguing, although some of the other groups were particularly intriguing as well. So the study itself, as I said, talks about a group of self-proclaimed bad boys who were between the age of 14 and 16 in southern England, and we used the concept of stigma, not necessarily in the study itself, but that came out later on in terms of other people's fear, blame, expression of judgments of shame that actually came through on a lot in the data. And we also used social capital because I was interested in how these young people are accessing spaces, how young people were received in those spaces, because actually if we put it into that context, then those are the sorts of experiences they're likely to meet in society, if not already. And I was particularly keen to see how the body, how these young people interacted and how they were received in those particular communities. Because actually, I hope, and that certainly the idea is that they would be accessing the spaces in the college that would make them a better worker, make them a better person. And certainly that was the idea of alternate provision. So social capital was very important, but I also wanted to use social capital because it was a study which involved the young people. So it was participatory research. I gave them cameras, I wanted to know where they were going, how they were doing it, how they were using the spaces, what spaces were they accessing, but also they could engage with the data when I'm talking about social capital. So social capital being about trust, being about networks, being about loyalty, being about all those different things that young people did very well, and they were more than capable of telling us about that. So I thought that was a really good theory to use and as a base to look at their particular experiences. So I'm particularly keen on using the Badiou as well, because he believes that his theories should be more like exercise books. So being able to look at the environment and deconstruct that environment and see where young people, not necessarily young people placed within that environment itself. So in terms of students, in terms of where we are in exclusions, I think a good statistic that always raises an eyebrow is the amount of young people who are permanently excluded in English schools. So currently, 2016-17, there was 7,220, I believe, across all schools in England. Again, that is certainly something to look at. I think that has increased just slightly over the last few years. But in 2016-17, while 7,220 roughly young people were excluded from schools in England, there was 5 excluded in Scotland, which my maths is not great, but that's around 143 times more likely for young people to be permanently excluded from English schools. So there was certainly something going on in the education system in England that was different to Scotland. I know people talk about public health approaches in Scotland, etc., and the public services are set up in different ways, and that's certainly one thing, strand of research around to do, work to do in the future. So there's been an increase of 44% of young people since 2010. Around 4% of young people are now educated in some form of alternative education, whether that be permanent full-time. 30% are identified with disability or SEN. Around over 50% are permanently excluded who are SEN, as we said, and professionals and staff are 3 times more likely to lack specific qualifications for working in educational systems as of 2017. So alternative education is defined by law as, for particular reasons, exclusion, illness, behaviour, that young people find themselves outside of the mainstream education system. The study itself had interviews, focus groups, documents, observations, went over a period of a year broadly, in and out of the facility. I got to know the young people very well. I got to know where they were, how they operated, and gave a lot of trust in terms, and they were exceptional and working with me. And of course it was participatory methods. I wanted to hear their voices. I wanted to find out what was going on with those young people themselves. So in terms of the spaces they found, it was very limited. So particularly the boys wanted to go to different spaces, social spaces, but those activities were sort of taken away from them. In this particular context, they weren't actually allowed to go out into the college itself on break times. It seemed too much of a risk, so they had separate break times at the college itself. There was very much a performative behaviourist regime within the college, and it was the idea that the schools were paying these facilities to change behaviours. So they were inoculating sort of behaviours, particularly 14-16, that were edging towards work and work specific. So you'd often find that predominantly, if not 100% of young people, young males, were doing motor mechanics where girls were doing hair and beauty. And that was seen as a sort of a normal thing. Very much vocationally orientated activities. Maths, English were there. Didn't see a lot of range of critical sort of studies, or when young people could see themselves in particular positions and why they ended up in positions. And I think Thompson hit the nail on the head when their study concluded that actually what was happening was behavioural hugs and behavioural points, and the types of approaches that some alternative provisions takes. Now, again, it's not to say that there isn't excellent teaching going on in alternative provisions. I think there is. I think there's also alternative provisions who struggle, partly because of the situations that they find themselves in terms of disadvantaged areas. You're far more likely to find an accumulation of concerns in different areas than others, and there's no question about that. But often I found, particularly in this facility, there was a strict binary choice between either conform to what we want you to do in terms of an identity deficit, deference, this idea of you need to do what we need to do, or else you're going to get more support. And obviously some of the sort of white working class boys particularly resisted that quite vehemently and didn't see themselves as part of that, or didn't feel like they belonged at all in that alternate provision, if the college itself. So they often conveyed the idea of a bad boy, or the identity being something bad, as a form of incarceration. And some of the quotes that the young people use in the study are quite useful to look at as well. But what I found most alarming was not necessarily the alternate provision itself, but actually the reaction from other people in the college. So it was a very diverse college, a very well-run college, a very successful college that took in lots and lots of different kinds of what you'd expect from further education, lots of diverse range of students from backgrounds, various backgrounds. So it would be what I found, or what we found as a surprise, was that they were not included as we assumed. That actually you would think that in a diverse background that the college drew its students from, that these young people might be accepted, but actually it was quite the opposite. We had lots of situations where these young people were bullied, told to go back to school, ignored, which was probably the worst, and they reacted in as a lot of young males might. Or young males once been threatened and stigmatised and bullied, and they reacted and done exactly the same back, and that sort of made the situation even worse, because of course they're under strict regimes in terms of where they can go, who they can interact with, which sort of made the situation worse. They were told to go back to school repeatedly. We had young people who were good friends with young people from their neighbourhood that we talked to when they were at school, who would no longer talk to them in the college, etc., which was a horrible experience for anybody, which we found quite alarming, hence the stigma part of the theory that we used. And in lots of cases were denial of activities. So football, if you're 14 years old, you cannot play, or at least you were told you cannot play with 16, 17-year-old students in the facility, and that was quite alarming for these young people, because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to play sports, and there's a sense of masculinity they get from accessing those spaces as well. But a 14-year-old, most of the college's activities were orientated towards those who were over the age of 16. And again, that's an aspect of that capital being taken away from these young people as well. But I think most alarming is actually over 80% of the young people in the study said they had experienced bullying as a result of college. And of course, one of the things the article talks about is this identity. So can young people draw from the identities that are available within the college? And one of the aspects of identity that the young people talked about a lot was this cool aesthetic identity. And that was very much the identity that took a lot of what we would frame the capitals. So if you had the aspects of those identity you can pull from the college, and you would gain from that environment because you could move around so free easily. So Badiou talks about the fish in water. So you have to naturalise your identity in order to pull from these forms of capital that are available. And of course, one of the things about being young, one of the things about having a smaller bodies, in some cases, real aspects of their masculinity, they were unable to access those spaces where popular students would hang out, and also they were shamed. So there was that special social class, the way people dressed, because of course a lot of young people at the age of 16, 17, 18 have jobs, they can buy clothes, they can buy cool clothes, and they have access to those spaces, they can use those spaces in particular ways and gain from those. But when you are the opposite of that, then that can be quite problematic. And Badiou talks quite a lot about that in terms of being the losers in a battle for symbolic resources. So what eventually happened was these young people sort of came back and they called a room of their own. So they were forced into these sort of dense, high trust, reciprocal networks that are most associated with gangs, but I wouldn't go that far in terms of these young people. But certainly it was about them, that it was about loyalty. So they were drawing on these discourses again, of sort of class-based discourses of loyalty or solidarity, when actually the college was trying to say make them be individuals and overcome a lot of these things that they failed through in school, but actually they were being forced back into those spaces. And the sort of learning and knowledge and development and learning from each other, from other people in the college never happened, because they were quite the distance. In fact, quite the opposite started to happen, and they struggled quite alarmingly. So there was no identity development, there was no renewal. They just sort of pulled back into their own sort of room of their own, as they eloquently described it themselves. So in terms of moving from there, I think that there's a lot of work to be done around where we go with alternative provisions, and there's lots of different answers to that. There's lots of different questions whether young people themselves should actually be in alternative provision, but I do think that alternative provision will form a part of the education system. To what end, we're not so sure at the moment, but certainly it seems as if alternative provisions are here to stay, at least for a little while, and how we deal with these young people in these facilities are very important to discover. So one of the different things is definitely the training for staff, because there was such a high staff turnover. You had some staff that were very good with young people in terms of engaging with them, and others who weren't. But I think the biggest issue was certainly staff turnover. I think the biggest issue was their attitudes towards some of these young people. Some of the tutors were threatened by college management that if they didn't do certain things that they would end up having to teach these young people as almost a threat, which is problematic. But certainly training for some staff would be beneficial. Some staff were instinctively good working with young people, but I think things like youth work skills are very important. Understanding young people from different perspectives, building trust with these young people are absolutely fundamental. And if you don't have that, particularly with the bad boys, they will, because again, they're coming from background where, or have certain tactics that they've grown up with that work very well for them in terms of giving them their own space. So working with them on that level is very important. I think the implications for policy are quite important, that we need to get this right. They need to come out of alternative provisions with viable qualifications, with viable route into the community, as I talked about when I was younger, that there actually was spaces for me and my mates to go into, where a lot of those spaces have been shut down now for these young people, and the sense of a sort of working class identity has been taken away, and particularly if you have particular issues with forms of disability, special educational needs, and fitting in with spaces and relations can be quite challenging as well. So one of the more controversial issues around where these young people are likely to end up. There's a big piece of research going on, I think, at Edinburgh at the moment, in terms of exclusion and prison. I know I spoke with a colleague in America who said it's similar over there. If you get excluded from school, you're more likely to end up in prison. Statistically, I think it's over 60%. Now, again, a lot of work needs to be done. There's a lot of cause and effect going on there that we need to look at as well in terms of research. So fundamentally, alternative spaces of failure has been well received. As I said, 5,000 reads and hopefully more. These young people's voices are being heard, which is tremendous, given the fact that these young people, when I was speaking to them, said, well, no one wants to listen to us, but actually they do. And I think more kinds of research like this needs to be done, but always with them being mindful of moving these young people onto spaces where essentially they can move forward. They can either feel comfortable within themselves, or just generally have different resources to pull on with different options, which we're sort of closing down at the moment for these young people. So hopefully this talk gave you some insight. The article is open access, Alternative Spaces of Failure, Disabled Bad Boys. Please do go and read it. I'm happy to receive comments. As I say, I do apologise for the quality of the video. My laptop is on its last legs. But you can reach out with me, and my email address, etc., is on the article itself that you can find within the Disability Society. So thank you for your time.